Iraqi economy is not going to restart on a major, large scale. But in the interim, a significant number of jobs might be created. There's an international dimension as well, especially when you look at budget execution. The US Congress, the British Parliament, indeed Iraqis themselves are simply not willing to accept that unless the Iraqi government spends its capital budget, and Jeremy Pam on my right is going to explain more about the details there. If they don't spend their own money, why should the US Congress appropriate US money to be spent here in Iraq? At bottom, when you look at the provincial reconstruction teams, of which Joe Gregoire is a representative, we see these PRTs as a vital element in assisting the units of local governance to deliver services by spending their budget allocation. So with that, let me turn to Treasury Attaché Jeremy Pam for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Carney. I think you've set out the overall challenge very clearly. Just to flesh out some of the numbers, last year's Iraq's budget last year was $34 billion. While all of the final data is not yet in, it looks like our current estimates are that they will end up having spent about 26 billion of that. Of the 8 billion that they didn't execute, well, of the 26 billion that they spent, that included much of their operating budget, as Ambassador Carney mentioned, including the salaries, which itself is better than it was a couple of years ago when there was difficulty even doing that. But of the 8 billion that wasn't spent, most of that, perhaps 5 billion, was from the capital budget, in a capital budget of a little over 6 billion. So most of the capital budget last year did not end up getting spent. Now that money that was not spent has been re-budgeted, put back into in the 2007 budget, essentially financing fully financing a deficit, a surplus of expenditures over revenues. So the good news is that Iraq has a second chance to spend that money, but in order to take advantage of that second chance, they have to do a better job of spending it in responsible, financially accountable ways. And I think the very promising news of the recent weeks and indeed days is that they are showing very strong indication of the readiness and a commitment and organization to do a better job spending that money and beginning capital projects. Just on Wednesday of this week, well, they passed their 2007 budget. The Council of Representatives passed it a few weeks ago, and they have issued the instructions necessary for provinces and ministries to begin spending it. And just this past Wednesday, there was a government-wide conference here in Baghdad in which the Deputy Prime Minister for Economics, the Finance Minister, and the Planning Minister called in the entire government, 10 or more ministers, including most of the key ministries, and a similar number of governors and others representing all of the provinces to discuss the subject of budget execution and how they could do better in 2007. There was an excellent discussion, and a great deal of useful information was passed out, and we have every indication that the Iraqis who attended that are going to go back and begin acting on it.
Let me move now, if I may, to Joe Gregoire, who runs the largest PRT in Iraq. That's the one for Baghdad City. Joe, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Carney. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I trust you will indulge me if I come across as a cheerleader for the provincial reconstruction teams. To me, the PRTs are the quintessential, the ultimate in Secretary Rice's initiative with regard to transformational diplomacy. The PRTs were stood up initially in November 2005, and they were stood up essentially to build government capacity at the local government level. PRTs have been using projects and training to promote transparency, accountability, and more effective local government, as well as to promote reconciliation, build civil society, and further economic recovery. Through the PRTs, we have given the Iraqis, whom we engage on a daily basis, lead in this process. They've been determining projects that we've been funding with U.S. funds. They've been implementing these along with some of our implementing partners. Their needs, and when I say their needs, I mean the needs of the Iraqis whom we engage, not the coalitions, drives the process and the objectives. The PRT allows for rapid mobilization of resources to tackle long-term problems, long-term development issues. We do this in large part because the PRTs are truly the quintessential civil military teams. Here in Baghdad, for example, we have approximately 90 people who compose this provincial reconstruction team, more than a third of whom are men and women in uniform. The other third are probably representatives of U.S. government agencies, and the remaining third are Iraqis who indeed are working day in and day out with us and with our Iraqi Oasts. The PRT is designed to kickstart developmental processes. I say kickstart because so many of these processes, and I'm thinking of development in particular, may take years to play out. Short-term gains build for long-term development and strengthen democratic gains. In Iraq, the PRT is supporting decentralization of government services. I think that's very important because the Constitution of 2005 provides for a devolution of powers to the provincial governments. And so our mandate is to see to it that we strengthen the provincial governments to indeed carry out their tasks. We essentially have been doing this by focusing on 5 thematic areas: rule of law, infrastructure, or the provision of essential services, economic development, governance, and public diplomacy. Ultimately, the PRT is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. This is something that my colleagues at the Department of State and our colleagues in the Department of Defense recognized from the very start. The PRTs will go out of business. And when they do go out of business, most likely it will be because they've been successful. And they will be replaced completely through and with normal assistance programs. Eventually, the PRT, which I'm leading, as well the other PRTs elsewhere in the provinces, will fall under the USAID mandate. And when they do, that will be a sign that indeed we have achieved the mission we were set out on. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador?
We'd be delighted to take questions at this point.
Well, I'm sure we have a few here, Ambassador, so let's go ahead and get started. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Vince Kroll. I'm with the U.S. Info State Department News Service, and I'm trying to get a sense on the PRTs. Could you just give us a flavor of what your day-to-day work is when you're out engaging with the public?
Joe, would you let these folks know what the day-to-day work of a PRT is all about?
Well, on any given day, Mr. Ambassador and ladies and gentlemen, we will have perhaps 4 or 5 engagements, most of them outside what we call beyond the wire. That is to say, engagements beyond the limits of the international zone. We typically will hold discussions with members of the Provincial Council. That is the premier or the dominant legislative institution within the province. And we will hold meetings on governance. By governance, I mean on policies, practices, and procedures that aim to build capacity within local government units or institutions. We will more often than not conduct 3 or 4 visits to police stations, detention centers, and the prisons in any given week, so that our colleagues can assess the conditions within these institutions, all with a view to building up capacity to ensure proper rule of law. We have virtually daily engagements with the officials at the Baghdad City Hall, more commonly known here as the Amanat, largely to coordinate the activities of numerous U.S. government agencies involved in the implementation of projects which aim to provide and meet the basic needs of the population, the inhabitants of the city. I think that's a typical day, not to speak of the many other meetings that we would normally attend at the embassy level.
Thank you.
Tony.
Mr. Carney, this is Tony Capaccio with Bloomberg News. There's a general impression in Washington that many of the billions of dollars that have been spent on Iraq reconstruction have been wasted, for want of a better word. You're aware of SIGIR reports from Stuart Bowen. You're aware of the Parsons audit on the police academy. Can you give, from your perspective, the whole issue of waste? Is there a way to quantify, from your perspective, how much actually has been wasted of the $20-odd billion spent to date? Again, there's a lot of suspicion about this in Washington.
I think the answer to that question resides in the reality of transparency. As you know, when Congress appropriated those billions of dollars for reconstruction in Iraq, they mandated the creation of the Special Inspector General for Iraqi reconstruction, and that's Mr. Stuart Bowen, whom you named. And the effort that Mr. Bowen and his associates, auditors, his team of investigators here in the field, living and working with us in the U.S. Embassy, has been put forth in a series of quarterly reports, and you're referring to one when you talk, for example, about the police academy, where the large contract was clearly inadequately done. Now, I have the advantage of coming to this office and this job in the wake of the President's announcement of new policies in January of this year. And I can argue, I think successfully, that my focus is on now and on what's going to happen in this period of surge, not only military surge, but also economic surge over the next 4 to 6 months. And I would submit that your particular question would be better addressed to the head of of IRMO, the Iraqi Reconstruction Management Office.
Bowen has also issued audits identifying what he calls a sustainment gap, a clumsy term, obviously, but the whole notion of needing dollars beyond building to sustain projects that have been built and turned over to Iraqis to operate over the next several years. Do you have a concern that more money will be needed to bridge this so-called sustainment gap or problem that Bowen has identified?
I think in answer to your question, there is no question that when you put together a large brick and mortar project, let's call it a major bridge, for example, that you have to have an ongoing maintenance program to repair the bridge where needed. If it's damaged by floodwaters, for example, that you bring teams out, it'll need to be resurfaced from time to time. The point to make there is that Iraq is basically a rich country, that in fact there's been a successful effort to mightily reduce the debt that Iraq had incurred during the Saddam Hussein era. I would argue that as Iraq returns to its former levels of 3 million plus barrels a day of oil exported, that you're going to find as much money as the country needs for the major portion of this effort at maintenance and sustainment as you've defined it.
Ambassador Gordon Leubold from the Christian Science Monitor. At the beginning, in your opening statement, you seem to emphasize the idea of providing reconstruction money and projects to all Iraqis. Can you characterize the way in which you spend money to prove to some populations that they're going to get a piece of the pie as well?
Yes, thanks. Then let's not put too fine a point on it here. Let's say we're talking about Shia and Sunni and Kurds, and in particular Sunnis who have been suffering on the one hand and at the same time engaging with Al-Qaeda to provoke Shia, with the result being something new since I was here almost 4 years ago, which is to say the large scale of sectarian violence. But if you look at the government's requirement to be the government of all Iraqis, you need look no further than Anbar province, which is heavily Shia, as I believe you know. Anbar, like the other provinces, has a budget allocation. It's going to be somewhere in the vicinity over $200 million, I would suggest. I know that the government sent a large chunk of monies for Anbar. I beg your pardon, I said Anbar was Shia, I meant it as heavily Sunni, I misspoke. I know the government has answered some of those needs in Anbar province because it sent most of the capital budget to Anbar, to Sunni Anbar province, in the form of cash because there aren't functioning banks, and the province apparently didn't have a bank account. So it sent nearly the dinar equivalent of more than $20 million to be secured at one of the coalition military bases in the province. That seems to me to be a sign, an evidence of the kind of good faith effort towards ensuring the Sunni areas of Iraq are in a position to make contracts and deliver the services that the people need, at least a good indication of that.
Are you saying there that you're sending a disproportionate amount, perhaps more, to a Sunni area to prove to the Sunnis that they're getting a piece of it as well? Is it?
In fact, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that Anbar is getting its fair share. As I understand it, the roughly $2.5 billion of the capital budget that goes to provinces does so on the basis of population. But Jeremy, you might be able to comment on that.
That's right. There has been both in 2006 and in the current year of 2007, the current budget of 2007, the provincial allocations were based on population. And for the most part, there haven't been disagreements about the broad distributions. And so in 2007, for instance, Anbar province has been budgeted more than $100 million for capital projects, and in 2006 it received a similar amount.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Louis Martinez with ABC News. Ambassador Carney, do you find yourself operating under some kind of a timeline as to when you want to see some form of success on the economic front? You call this the economic surge. We heard that from military commanders that they don't expect any good readouts on how their operations are succeeding until late summer. What is your estimate of when you'll see some progress?
Well, I'd be a fool to lay out some sort of timeline that becomes cast in stone. I think, frankly, within a relatively short time, I'm talking about a few months, you're going to see the emergence of the trends that I've remarked on, trends on budget execution, the passage of the laws that are so key to the functioning of the society. I'm less certain on the jobs, but frankly, that may be ignorance on my part. I just haven't gotten myself smartened up on that aspect of the issue yet.
Sir, Mr. Ambassador, this is Jim Garamo from American Forces Press Service. But, you know, a lot of people for the last couple of months have been talking about how important the hydrocarbon law is. What's the prognostication for that right now? And a second question, maybe it's to Jeremy. Financial institutions have been wrecked since, you know, essentially we got in there, and everyone is, military officials and State Department officials have talked about the need to resurrect the financial institutions. How is that going? Is there progress?
Well, let me start with, it isn't one law for hydrocarbons. I believe it's 4. And the first one, indeed the very important one, the one that gives oil as a patrimony of all Iraqis, is the one that's been approved by the Council of Ministers and is teed up to go to the Parliament, which here is called the Council of Representatives. Now, there are 3 other laws that relate to revenue sharing and the establishment of an Iraqi national oil company, and yet another one, the title of which escapes me, that are going to have to be drafted, going to have to work through the cabinet, and then go as a package, as I understand it, to the Council of Ministers. I would guess that's going to take a few months as well, but you know, I've, for example, served in Indonesia, which is a major exporter of oil and gas, and these oil questions in diverse and plural societies are absolutely vital and require the most careful sets of negotiations. And I believe I can point to the framework law as evidence that that process is something that Iraqis are capable of meeting. Now, Jeremy, if you'd address the institutional lack here in Iraq.
Sure. It's certainly true that the financial institutions in Iraq are not what they need to be for a sustainable economic recovery. Some of that is nothing new. It's the legacy of the functions, the ways in which banks were used during the Saddam period. Banks here were not full-service banks in the Western sense of the word, of the concept, and served and didn't serve the function of intermediating between capital flows. Instead, they were primarily payment systems. They primarily served as payments, as systems for payments of government salaries, and they continue in most places of the country. They continue to serve that function. The situation in Anbar province that Ambassador Carney mentioned is the exception rather than the rule, where even that basic function has run into difficulty. Nonetheless, it's true that the financial system has to be rejuvenated and begin performing a broader range of financial services, and the Iraqis have been working on that. The central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and others have been recently discussing plans towards that end. I don't think that the details of this have been announced yet, but I'm confident that there is progress. That progress has been made even in recent weeks, and we'll continue to see more movement in the near future.
Thank you.
We probably only have time for one more, Al.
This is Al Pessin from Voice of America. Can you tell us how it's going in the effort to expand the, create and expand the provincial PRTs? Is the military delivering the folks that it said it would? Do they have the right specialties? And how goes the effort to get more folks from state and other U.S. government agencies to volunteer to go out there in a few months and replace the military folks, as well as the effort to recruit contractors for the same purpose? So how's all that going?
I think I can reply in a word that I do not have the full details on that, but I have a general knowledge that this process is going forward, that the military who are being sought for the intermediate period while state tries to go out and recruit, including among other U.S. government agencies, are more or less identified, that the extra 10 PRTs are in the process of being stood up. But frankly, you should address that question to somebody who's got a much more current knowledge. Joe, are you perhaps more up to date than I am on this?
Well, I do have some information, specifically that the Department of State has recruited all team leaders for the new PRTs that will be embedded within the brigade combat teams. I know the department is actively recruiting other Corps personnel, and I believe, although I cannot state as a certainty, that the military is also canvassing its civil affairs components to see whether or not there are people, whether it be in the reserves or who might be redeployed, who do have an interest in serving on PRTs. I think the process is working as fast as we might expect it to be at this point.
Great. Thank you.
Carl, is it a quick one? And we'll sneak it in here.
Yeah, I got to be quick. Ambassador, I'm Carl Osgood. I write for Executive Intelligence Review. The UN agencies have estimated that somewhere around 3 million Iraqis have been displaced because of the violence, including a fair number of those outside of the refugees outside of the country. I'm wondering what impact that displacement of the population has on your efforts.
You make a good point. There are a large number of Iraqi families that have been not only displaced, but many, many others who have actually fled, including a large number of professional people who would be enormously valuable in economic efforts here in Iraq. There's a focus, I believe the Secretary of State herself has raised this issue in testimony on the Hill, was it perhaps not last week? And it's a well-placed focus. I have just come to this press conference from a meeting at the Prime Minister's residence where there was a focus with the authorities who are competent in the city of Baghdad and the Iraqi security authorities as well, talking about the conditions under which people might be brought back into their homes, the security that's necessary, as well as the issue of dealing with squatters who've taken over homes. It's a thorny, complex problem. It's one that seems to be understood as indeed a difficult matter to deal with, but one that's quite urgent.
Well, gentlemen, if you'd allow me to bring this to a close, and to thank you one more time for joining us this evening. It's not often that we get an opportunity to talk to experts that are working the reconstruction aspects of the activities that are going on in Iraq, and so it's been very helpful for us, and we appreciate your time, and perhaps we can do this again in a couple of months and you can give us a further update.
We look forward to it, and you're very welcome.
Thank you.